And I mean, a big part of that too for me has been when the shadow is there, like when the manipulator shows up, because she does, like my little inner manipulator is like very crafty and manipulative.
Mhm.
And so there's this idea of like, oh, I need to cast that away. I need to not be that way. And just like you try to shove it out of your psyche. Like, I don't want that. And so what has been so important and healing to me is to be able to recognize it, or whenever I do recognize it, make space and love that part of me. Like I mean, we all develop things for certain reasons, but it's like seeing the little girl that only got things sometimes because she manipulated,
Mhm.
and like picking her up and loving her and just saying, I got you. Like, you don't have to go to him. Like, you don't have to get him to see you. Like, I see you, and I'm going to rock you, and I'm going to love you, and I'm going to take care of you. So it's not pushing anything out. It's loving it into wholeness, like integrating that little manipulator and all the shadow selves, all those unintegrated parts of ourselves, loving them into wholeness.
All the little ghost children.
Oh my goodness. Like, yes.
Yeah, that's really cool. I think, and I want to hear your perspective on this, because as someone who is raised fundamentalist Christian, and like I'm from New Jersey, so we have religion obviously up north, but my family was Roman Catholic, but I learned this term down here. I don't know if it's PC or anything, but it's Creaster. So like the people that only go to church on Christmas and Easter. So we were those. And like now no one goes. I'll go to church occasionally. I do enjoy the experience of picking up the energy of the room and letting it carry me off into the ethers.
Yes.
And that's certainly not every church, or limited to church. But I think it's important to recognize the ghost children for what they are, and recognize those manipulative tendencies as an attempt to meet your own needs.
Right.
Instead of pushing it away, I think that the further you push away one of your little ghost children, the more it develops into the Leviathan and that huge demon that's so consuming, and like now you're blind to it. You can't see anything.
Yes.
And it grows out of control. And the simple remedy is to take the flashlight and to go into the dark. I think one of the interesting things about some churchianity right now is run away from the demon because the demon is bad,
right?
Instead of get to know your opponent,
right?
So that you know what you're working with. And if you get to know that opponent, just the way, a football team watches recorded videos of their opponent's quarterback, and they try to learn their plays. The more you know about what you're facing, the better you're going to be at defeating it. Do you need to defeat a ghost child? No. All you need to do is meet the need. And you can do that manipulatively, or you can just ask outright as you shed the light of consciousness on it.
And in coaching, like one of the tools that I use is to have my clients, kind of personify these parts of themselves, like as we're doing a process of meditation and visualization. And then I have them like ask this shadow piece, like, what do they need? Almost 100% of the time, it's just love. Like, it's just love. And so, it's funny you said Creaster. That's hilarious. So and I haven't heard that term, because I try to explain to people like the special brand of fundamentalist that I was raised in, and I have absolutely no negative feelings about that anymore. I did for a while, but it was so intense that we had this term SMO, and that was Sunday morning only. So if you're a Sunday morning only and you don't go to the midweek service, you're not really the real kind of Christian. So it was like that intense. And it's so funny because there was also some like deep spirituality inside of it. And so I'm like reconnecting with that and if you're watching this and you're like, she's anti-Christian, I'm actually really not. I have so much love for the stories in scripture. I actually plan to write a book about one of them. I'm working on that little idea right now. But yes, it's all about loving the shadows. And one of the things that I discovered within myself, so I had this fear that I had, it was something like in my specific denomination, they would call a Jezebel spirit. And so like I was raised in a very charismatic, fundamentalist, charismatic type movement that was like speaking in tongues and running around the church and like dancing and shaking and all of that. So you can see why I can still find a lot of like, I remember going to my first embodiment retreat and I was like, oh my gosh, I feel like I'm at church. And at first I was super triggered, but then I was like, oh, like this is not a bad thing. Like, and now I'm like, I'm shaking and speaking in tongues and doing all the things, just not like in a religious type setting. And so where was I going with that? Yeah, so there was a lot of good within that. It was just that it was kind of also heaped, like kind of like a rules-based type performance.
Mm-hmm.
That has been another big thing. And maybe that was like to get me to the segue of a huge part of my personal sexual, because I'm looking at like your questions and it's like triggering thoughts in me.
Spread them out.
Yeah. So like a huge part of my personal healing has been to completely recognize and really, I was talking about Jezebel, but let me finish this thought and then I'll go back to that. To recognize the part of myself that wants to perform and to look at that from a sexual place and like, oh, wow, I actually am trying to get in these positions and make sure my belly's just right and all of that. And to be able to say like, no, that's not what this is about. Like this is about connection and healing and transformation and creativity. So that has been, and so then to look at the rest of my life and say, where else am I being performative? And that's not what any of life is about, unless you are a performer in your own stage. And yes, perform away.
Yeah, that's fun too.
Yes,
it's certainly allowed.
Yes, and like that performance, like is for performing, but life is not for performing. But the Jezebel piece. So I was raised with this fear of having a Jezebel spirit, which means like being slutty or manipulative and all of these things. And it like, I lost many nights of sleep over this fear because I was kind of hypersexual. And so a huge part of my healing I was actually in a process I was in, like someone brought me into a deep visualization meditation. And that was what came up, was like my inner Jezebel. And it was so funny because the person that was working with me was like, what part of you can find love for the Jezebel within you? And so as I tapped in, it was like the church lady, like the inner church lady, the buttoned up, like little perfect church lady. And I just had this inner visual of the church lady and the Jezebel becoming best friends and helping each other like balance out to where they both can be there. Like they both belong. Like, yes, there's times when I get like off, I get too rigid and I get too churchy and I get too this or that. And then there's times when I'm like just a wild woman and I want to like manipulate and like have all the sex and be crazy. So it's like recognizing like, yes, all of that's in there and it's in all of us. Like that's the nature of like archetypes and stuff. It's like, we all have it all. It's about what do we intentionally and consciously want to tap into?
Right. So one of the areas that I tend to judge, one of the areas that I'm still healing it. And so I tend to judge when women are still working towards leaving an abuser, which is not a great place for me as someone who's trauma informed. I need to be a little bit cautious about which clients I take. And if it's not a match because I can't be in my best energy, then I always refer out.
Yeah.
But that is an area for me that's still under construction, where I'm still taking the steps to accept my experience, to accept the damage that I allowed to be done to me, And so I think that it's important to just be aware of the things of yourself that you haven't accepted.
Mhm.
Or if, you know,
Yeah.
if they're in the shadow, you wouldn't know.
Yeah.
You have to look at the mirrors, the people
Right.
around you are mirroring back.
Yeah.
And we get clues about what's hidden in the shadow
Yeah.
based on our judgments and what shows up in them.
Yes.
So when I catch my judgment,
Yeah.
I get the opportunity to say, oh, there's some stuff in there that still needs to be addressed.
Mhm.
Someone shared with me about a woman who was trying to leave an abuser, and I had so much anger come up in me, and it shouldn't be directed at her.
Mhm.
That's my anger for the version of me that struggled for 5 years
Yeah.
to leave a marriage that was not slowly going downhill.
Right.
It bottomed out month 9
Yeah.
and got progressively worse.
Yeah.
And I knew that the trust would never be rebuilt
Mhm.
after that. And so a part of it is learning to grieve, fully
Mhm.
grieve
Right.
what happened and say, yeah, that did happen. There's no reverse button. You
Mhm.
can't click the controller and go back in time and make it any different. It did happen.
Yeah.
What do I need in my grieving process to make all of those emotions okay
Mhm.
so that I can come into that full acceptance? And I think full acceptance is very close, if not overlapping with forgiveness.
Mhm.
And that becomes the point where I'm able to work with the women that are trying to leave without
Yeah.
adding my own mental energies into
Right.
what they're doing, clouding their stuff that's happening.
Yeah. Yeah. That's so good.